this was this is where it all started on the Bennett Creek pad. First thing they did was they blocked off the natural drainage up here, which channeled all of the water that we get from flash floods and also any liquids that come off this pad down onto the horse pasture below, which is our property. So we were very concerned about the creek, Line Creek. We sit right on the Montana-Wyoming line, and hence the name Line Creek. And we were really worried about the creek because we know we irrigate right below this pad. And so we knew that anything that came off the pad would go directly into the creek. First problem was the natural drainage and all the we get a lot of flash floods here. And then the other issue was all of the liquids and the condensates and waste on the pad. There were two large fluids pits that sat on the east side of the pad, which held drilling and fracking fluids. That was an open system, drilling system. Those were a mess. They were lined, but the liners were all torn and ripped from the flare pit, which was right next to those pits. So the flare burned all the liners, and then the high winds that we get here took the liners. They were also buried illegally. So the first fights were over the pits. Then that was in 2000, the first well. As you can see, there are 4 wells on this pad. These are all conventional wells, so they were vertical wells, but they were all fracked. The 4th well was actually a vertical well that was drilled directionally to the pad about a quarter mile up, which is the Crosby pad. They had a lot of problems with that well, lots of cases of loss of circulation where they're drilling through such crazy geology here. This is highly fractured and fissured, as everything across the front is, on both sides, the Montana and the Wyoming side, because of all the natural occurring seismic activity here. And so they had a lot of problems drilling into those faults. So they would lose their fluids. The fluids wouldn't stay in the hole. The fluids would come back up the drill stem. On 2 occasions that actually left the pad 3 times, we had massive amounts of fluids leave the pad, go down the county road, through the horse pastures below and into the creek. That's where Windsor got their first notice of violation. The first company that was here was a company called NRA in 2000. And they bankrupted after drilling 3 of the wells that are here. And then Windsor bought the development with many of the same investors, I might add, that invested with NRA. And they came back and drilled the 4th well. The 4th well, as I said, actually their target hole was up there. And that was really the biggest problem well on this pad. They just couldn't get through the fracture zones. So at this point, these are very low producing wells. They were after gas. You can see there's this huge pump jack right here, which is a huge pump jack if you've seen many. This is actually to pull condensates and water, because what happens in this area is the gas comes into the target zones under extremely high pressure, but then they lose that pressure. They can harvest that gas, but then it's gone. And then they're left with condensates and a lot of water. And so they have to pull the water off. So you'll see they have the pump jack and then these hydraulic lifts right here, which are actually here not only to produce the gas, but to get rid of the water and to pull the condensates out. I think they're actually making more money off the condensates right now than they are the gas, although I haven't looked at the production records lately. These shacks that are behind us are separator shacks. You can hear the equipment running there.
Is that 24/7 that you're hearing that sound?
Yeah, that's 24/7. Yeah. We're standing, if you were to have a FLIR camera on this little shack right over here by the telephone pole, all those little tubes coming out of that shack are venting huge amounts of air emissions. So we're probably getting nailed right now because we're up downwind from that.
You can smell it.
Yeah. The separator equipment all sits on a series of, there were about 5 to 7 open pits. that Windsor in 2004, 2005 opened and closed periodically to dump waste into. And that became a huge issue because we knew that we were really worried that everything that was in those pits was going to migrate into a potable water well that they drilled right over there by those tanks, which of course is in the aquifer that we all use for drinking water. You can't really see it, it's to the left of that berm around those tanks. I toured this pad with some people that work on a lot of development out of the country in Latin America. And they told me that this pad was in the worst condition they'd seen anywhere. There were no berms, there were lots of spills and leaks. These open pits were horrible. It was a mess. And I have to say, through all of the vigilance of the people who live in this subdivision where this pad is drilled, we got it cleaned up. Of course, what you don't see here is all of the contamination underneath. From the time the water well went in over here, we were really concerned that we were going to have impacts from this development into that well. We asked the state over and over and over again to test that well, which they would never do. And of course, after the Crosby blowout in 2006, this potable water well became one of the 25 wells, down gradient wells, that are being tested in that monitoring program. And of course, they found contamination in it, and they also found contamination in the house right next door to the pad. We're standing in a highly contaminated area now. The contamination that is from these wells is a plume that we think is coming from the pits. Either the drilling fluid pits that were here where we're standing, or the waste pits over there where the separator equipment is, or a combination of both. Those are all diesel range, heavier constituents, although there's been some allied chemicals in there that were probably from drilling or fracking fluids or some kind of fluids that were used on site. But the larger area is all part of the contamination from the Crosby blowout. I have two messages about this pad. First is we got the pad cleaned up, which was huge, but you don't want this in your neighborhood at all, because it's not a matter of what's going to happen or if something is going to happen. It's a matter of when it's going to happen and how often it's going to happen, because that's the nature of the beast. This is a heavily industrialized development that has very little oversight and hardly any regulation. My husband and I do a lot of horseback riding in this area, and so this is on a state section that corners into the Line Creek Wilderness Subdivision. So we used to cross across this, where this pad is now, and go up onto public and private lands up above and into the mountains on horseback. And so we rode across here all the time, and we saw that it was flagged off. But in Wyoming at that time, the companies could come onto state land and prepare the pad, bulldoze all the soil off the pad, and put the pits in. The pits that were here were, the original pits were held an acre-foot each of drilling fluids, so they were huge pads before they get their permit. So even though we knew that it was flagged off, and we immediately started trying to find out why it was flagged off, there was really no avenue to even establish what was going in here. The state of Wyoming receives almost, depending who you talk to, 75 to 85% of its revenue from the extractive industry. And so we're a very pro-development state. So most people that are here pay low taxes because of this industrial development. And certainly the economy of this state is built around extraction, oil and gas and coal. We have one right as property owners in Wyoming, and that is to pay taxes. And we don't pay as much as other people do, but we also have no say over what happens on our property. In Wyoming, if you don't own all of your minerals and your surface, you cannot have any say about what happens on your surface, because the mineral owner is the estate that has preference. They're the dominant estate, and they have the right to develop their minerals. Even if you own 99% of the minerals, that 1% that somebody else owns, those people have the right to develop those minerals, and they have the right to use your surface to get those minerals out of the ground. In Wyoming, there are 3 estates. There's the surface estate, which is the surface, the mineral estate, which includes all of the minerals, and the pore estate, P-O-R-E. The pore estate is the void underneath the surface. And that estate was established about, I guess 3 or 4 years ago now, because we have a huge coal business here, and so we're really interested in carbon sequestration. And so one of the ways, of course, that you sequester carbon is into those voids. And so that became an issue, like how you're going to regulate how that happens. So at this time, so what happened with the 2 major estates, the service and the mineral, is that during the homesteading of the West, the government gave the surface rights to, well, the first homesteading that was done, when you came out to homestead, you got both your minerals and your surface. But as the later acts went into play, the government kept the minerals and only gave the surface to the homesteaders. So in some cases, the federal government owns the minerals underneath your property. In some cases, the families or whoever they sold those minerals to from the original Homestead Acts own the minerals. There are very few people who own all of their minerals or even any of their minerals that live on the surface today. Thanks to a lot of good work by Powder River Basin Resource Council and other people in Wyoming, surface owners in Wyoming, we do have a Surface Owners Act that now makes it enables the surface owner to negotiate with oil and gas companies about what kind of use is going to happen on that surface. However, if you don't establish an agreement with them, they still bond onto you. They put a bond up with the state and can come onto your surface anyway. So you at least have some time to negotiate some kind of an agreement about, you can't stop them from coming on, but you can certainly have a little bit of influence over where infrastructure, pads, roads go, power lines. So it's better than it was, but no, you can't stop them. And you certainly, yeah, you're not going to stop them. The first thing I would tell anyone who's going to buy property is to really investigate what the laws are in whatever state you're in, what the laws are about extraction, and then to look at who owns the minerals, and if those minerals have been leased to an oil and gas company, and get as much information as you can about the mineral owners and the companies that have leased. And then you have to make a very, and you need to educate yourself about the laws of that state and how that development could take place on your surface. And then you have to make some really educated decisions about whether you want that property. I've lived along the front for the majority of my life. I grew up right over the Montana border and grew up between Red Lodge and Cody and have been on the front my whole life. And my family's been here for like 4 generations. My great-grandparents were here. You know, they came from out of this country to live here. And so I have a real tie to this area. And I love this place where we live. It's a beautiful piece of property, but if I had known what I know now when we purchased this property, I don't think I would have purchased it. When this kind of development comes into your neighborhood, it becomes about that development. It becomes about how you can protect yourself and your family, and you start having to make decisions about whether you improve that property, whether you build a house or not, whether it's even safe for your kids to be there, whether you should drink your water, whether the air is clean. I mean, look around. We live in, you know, at the headwaters in one of the most pristine areas in Wyoming. And we live with huge contamination and air quality issues. So you really want, for anybody who's looking at property, regardless of where you are, you need to find out what's really going on with both the surface and the subsurface. It's not a matter of if something's going to happen. It's a matter of when and how often incidents are going to happen. I don't call them accidents because they're not accidents. You would have to be deaf, dumb, and stupid in today's world to not know what this kind of industrial development does, unless you're not paying attention. Because oil and gas, and this is specific to Wyoming, but any state, as more states become more dependent on an economy built on extractive industry, then they're going to be more supportive of that industry. Because let's face it, we don't have a lot to sell in this country these days. One thing that we still have is our natural resources. So I wouldn't want to be in the position to decide how much leverage you give to that industry. What's going to happen is, first of all, any surface disruption that is going to happen to you, you're going to have to deal with. If you're having fluids coming off the pad onto your property, you're going to have to be the person that documents what those, what's happening, what those emissions are, what those leaks and spills are. You're going to have to be a fairly good photographer so you can photograph them. You're going to have to keep excellent notes, which means you're going to have to get behind writing everything down. You're going to have to become a press person, because in order to create any change and get your government actually involved with what's happening to your property, you're going to have to go to the press and make a big deal out of it. You better be prepared to fight with your whole community, because most people are going to think you're an environmental wacko. You're going to then have to deal with what that's doing to your property in terms of actual impact to the surface. And then you're going to have to start what comes down the road, 5, 10, maybe 15 years down the road, is the kind of contamination that's left behind. Air emissions are huge. In the beginning of this battle, I've been impacted by this for 15 years, 16 years now. We were very concerned about groundwater and water impacts. We weren't even thinking about air. You know, we were thinking something's going to get into the groundwater and that's what's going to affect us. We weren't even thinking about air. And the reality is that the constant barrage of air emissions is, I would say, as damaging, maybe more damaging than the water contamination. So then it becomes, and then you start recognizing the changes in your water, the leaks, the spills that happen, the truck traffic, the dust, the constant barrage of people coming in and out of your community that aren't a part of your community, the lights, the noise, I mean, the list goes on and on. Things explode, separator shacks explode, and the high winds takes things away. We had like pallets and pallets of chemicals piled on this pad that were not part of the chemicals for fracking, they were part of the chemicals for drilling. Unlike fracking, which is actually done at a mixing facility, drilling chemicals are dumped into the hole on site. And so we had these pallets, probably, tens, probably 50 pallets, huge pallets of chemicals. They were all shrink wrapped. The wind took all that shrink wrap and shredded it, and it was all over our pasture and all down the creek. Separator shack, like I said, separator shacks exploding and all of that going down the creek. I mean, you know, leaks, spills, trucks spilling stuff as they were pulling produced water out, them dumping produced water down the road as they're going. Loss of circulation events when the drilling fluids and condensates or fracking fluids come up out of the hole and leave the pad and flow downhill into whatever is below the pad. The list goes on and on and on. It's insane. A lot of the constituents that you're subject to and that you're impacted by are probably, may not affect you until it's a cumulative effect on your system. You don't get sick right away. Although when the Crosby blowout occurred, I had an asthmatic episode. I've never had asthma. I had an asthmatic episode. I had to go in and have treatments because I couldn't breathe. I get huge rashes on my arms, and when I'm subject to emissions, when I'm exposed to emissions now, you definitely develop a chemical sensitivity over time. I've had urinary tract problems that can't be accounted for, that nobody can figure out why I'm having. They're not paying for anything. They're not paying for any of the damage that they've done to our property. They're not paying for any of the loss of property that happens after you're living in an area that has this kind of development in it. And they certainly are not paying for any kind of medical care for you or your family that you may have now or that your kids are going to see down the road, because the exposures to them are far greater than they are to an adult. The saddest part about this particular development is that there's no real play here. There's not a lot of gas, there's not a lot of oil. The big boys have come and gone from here in the 60s and 70s. It wasn't worth harvesting anything then. We have no big shale plays here that are going to bring hundreds of jobs into the area or supply tons of gas or oil for the country forever. This is a relatively small amount of fossil fuels. And so everything else in this area, we're up against some of the wildest country that there is. This part of the Beartooth Front is where all of the wintering grounds are for elk and deer, all the ungulates, because it's warmer on this side. We have all the ungulates, all the bears, all the wolves are through here, all of the cats, sage grouse, tons of wildlife here. This is a hotbed of wildlife. It's also has some of the purest water there is, because it's all headwaters. The elk populations aren't in here like they used to be, so I think they move away from this kind of development. But I don't know, the point of this is that why would you put all of the beauty, all of the natural resources, all of the clean air, everything that you have here at risk, all of those resources at risk, so that a crappy little developer can come in and just screw everything up and not get any gas or oil to speak of anyway. They're right on the crick. They failed every rule for pit placement that the Wyoming and Gas guidelines has about where to place pits, because they're too close to the pits, or too close to the creek, too close to homes. This development that started in 2000 was like a train coming off the tracks. It was all of the things that we've already talked about happening time after time after time. Rig hands being drunk and going off the side of the road. They told us that the rig hands wouldn't be living here. They were. I mean, and in addition to all of the industrial accidents and incidents. And then in 2006, the blowout, which has been by far the most serious to date. But why would you risk all of that when there isn't even enough to really pull out of here? Not to mention all the private property that values that are affected. Private property values here, interestingly in Wyoming, when in Park County, it varies by county to county. In Park County, there is no way to establish any impacts from oil and gas development if you're a private property owner. So our property taxes continue to go up, even though we live in an area that's highly contaminated and has industrial development right next to it. Park County does not recognize any impacts from oil and gas. That's not how they determine what your property values are. Wyoming is also a buyer beware state, and so the real estate agents only have to disclose what they know, which means I have had a lot of calls from people who are looking at property here, and they are blown away by the fact that this is even here because they haven't been told. Part of the people who are the most upset about this are people who bought property not even realizing it was here. So it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning. Boy, if you're looking at property, you really need to research it. You need to look at the property, look at the surface rights, the mineral rights, talk to all the people that are living there, not just depend on a real estate agent to give you all of that information. I'm a huge believer in citizen activism. When this development moved in, actually everybody in this area really pulled together, and Line Creek really pulled together to make sure that this was done as safely as it could be. And we had a lot of eyes on what was happening here, and it was still horrific. And one of the things that really united the Clark community, which has over 400 homes in it, was a seismic exploration that happened after this development actually started. And that was a 75-mile seismic operation that went from basically here, all the way across the front to about halfway across Chapman Bench, from the tree line 5 miles out. So that area totally covered Clark, and all of those small, most of the people that live here are small property owners, although there are some big ranches that are still intact. So those people really united to fight that seismic exploration, and were very successful because, of course, from the beginning, when the companies came into seismic, they didn't tell you what the actual regulations were about their setbacks from your water wells, your homes, your stock tanks, your irrigation ditches. They came in with a contract and said, here's what we'll give you to access your surface, and here's the setback that we'll use. So they, of course, narrow that setback and come a lot closer than regulation actually calls for. If you sign that paper, then you've agreed to that setback. You've given them that variance. So it starts with citizens saying, again, educating themselves about what the rules and regs actually are and what you can ask for. We were very successful as a community in organizing around that and making sure that they honored those setbacks, so that those people were protected from not only that seismic operation, but from random wells coming in based on that seismic. We were able to hold the seismic off until people had a good understanding about what the rules and regulations actually were. That was all from citizen activism. That was not from any government entity. When the development started here, we called all of the big public lands advocates who do great work in this area. I'm not dissing them at all. They do amazing work and very important work. And we called all of the state agencies and regulators to try to find out what was happening here and how we could get some help. And interestingly enough, they all told us to go to Powder River Basin Resource Council. And so what I can tell people is it's really important to support the grassroots organizations that are on the ground, that are working on the issues that you're interested in, and get active with them, and then really educate yourself and really learn about the area that you live in and what your rights are, so that it's not a huge shock. And then you can create change. We've created a lot of change. We created a lot of change with the seismic. We created a lot of change with how this development has been done. We were able to stop, we didn't stop the other wells that were permitted in this area from going in, but certainly the amount of attention that was put on this area and the amount of people that required their rights be recognized meant that we successfully stopped any development from moving into this area for the time being. And the most important thing we did was we stopped a permit and the lease on the Shoshone Forest right above us. My career history has always been in food and beverage, from the time I was very young until this development started. I'm lucky because I was able to transition that career into something new, which is working on these issues. So I've been an organizer with Powder River. I've been involved with Powder River for over 15 years, and I've worked for them for the last 15 years as a community organizer, both in Clark and in Pavilion, Wyoming, and in the Bighorn Basin, in the Deaver area. So I'm lucky because I was able to make that switch. But I can also tell you that it has come at an incredible price to my personal life, my family. As I said before, you can't just, when you are forced to live with this, and you are forced to live with this unless you leave, unless you can leave. A lot of people, by the time they recognize the impacts, can't leave because their property isn't worth what they have to have out of it. But if you live with this, you have to become a lawyer, a reporter, you have to be able to understand, a chemist, you have to understand what you're being exposed to, how you're being exposed to it, what you can do to protect yourself. Because the actual truth is that government does not have the funding or the capabilities or the manpower to do any of that. And they're in this state anyway, and in most states where this development is occurring, their main priority is making sure that they get the money from that development rather than protecting the people who are impacted. And that was a sad thing for me to learn. It was very sad for our kids, because I think that it took a lot of what we all think is our rights of being Americans. Our son was 10 years old when this started, and he was in school, and they were doing like I don't know what you call it, but all of the programs that they were doing were based on one issue, and at that time they were doing government, and so he would go to school, and it would be all about for the people, by the people, and he'd come home, and we were running around with our hair on fire, and people were like, just. It was a horrible situation. We were getting exposed to tons of stuff. Our government wouldn't help us. We were in constant battles with everybody from local government up to the feds. We were distraught. Everything that he was being taught he should have as a citizen of this country and of this state, he was not living. He was living something just the opposite. So that's one of the things that I really feel the most betrayed by, is the lack of protection from our government. Everybody disses industry, and quite frankly, we live in under capitalism, like it or not, that's how we live. And that means that the companies have a responsibility for one thing, and that's to make money for their shareholders. And so it's not their responsibility to protect the people, the citizens who are living around their development. That duty is the government's responsibility and duty, and they're not fulfilling their mandate. They're not fulfilling their mandate to protect their citizens, their private property, or health. And I work with a lot of people now that have lived with this development for a long time, and there are many, many people who are very ill from this, and they're not getting any help. So in 2006, actually early in the day, my office is in the back of the trailer, and it was August 11th, 2006. Yep, August 11th. And I was in my office, and it was a really hot day, so I had everything shut. I had the swamp cooler on, and which is our cooling system. And everything was closed up, and all day I had like a really runny nose, and my eyes were watering, but there was tons and tons of traffic on the road, and so I thought it was dust. And I assumed that, it was. That's another thing that we haven't talked very much about, is the amount of dust that you get, not only off the pads, because then you have all loose dirt, but the roads and the traffic. That was one of the worst things as far as immediate impact, was just you're living with all of this dust all the time. You can't breathe. You've got, problems from that. The dust is everywhere. Anyway, so I assumed it was the dust. And at about 6 o'clock that afternoon, my neighbor, a guy named Bob Aholt, and the Aholts were great. They were really in this fight with us. They fought really hard. He came home from work, and as he dropped into the subdivision, he saw the well blowing out here on the Crosby pad. And so he came up to the pad to find out what was going on. That's a great shot there of both pads. He came, so you can see where he dropped to, where the road comes down into the subdivision. So he had a bird's eye view of the well. and it was blowing. And so he came up here to find out what was going on. He went back home and he said, this is no joke, the well's blowing and we have to evacuate.
What does that mean, blowing?
Well, the technical term of a blowout is when they lose control of the well, and so all of the emissions, all of the methane and air and stuff is uncontrollable, and in many cases it ignites because methane is highly flammable. That did not happen here. What happened here is, so anyway, so he came, he said, the well's out of control, they're having a blowout, we have to get out of here. So we had spent a lot of our time as this development unfolded, and it had been 6 years, right, since we'd been fighting it. So we'd get together and have a beverage, often days. And, you know, a lot of what you do is you just kind of laugh about your situation because you can't do anything else. It's either laugh or cry. And we'd say, well, the only thing left is, you know, something's going to really explode and a well's going to fall over or blow up. And so that had been kind of a topic of our conversation many times. And he said, honestly, this is no joke. That's what happened. So what happened is early that morning, they had hit their target depth and for gas, and it was like just about 9,000 feet. And it was under extremely high pressure. So they had this huge amount of pressure that they knew they had, and then suddenly they lost pressure. They had no pressure, and not only was the pressure gone, but the drilling fluids were gone. So they had lost circulation of the fluids, and they also had lost pressure in the well. So they started trying to figure out what was going on, right? It was a Friday. And by sometime in the afternoon, I'm not sure when, because of course we weren't privy to that information, they started seeing these blowholes all up here along the hillside where you see the monitor wells.
These little black.
Posts, the black posts. They started seeing blowholes up here and up dip behind us, and all around the well site. They started seeing these like mud and condensate liquids spewing from the ground.
Like geyser, almost looking.
Like the mud pots in Yellowstone is what it looked like. And so they were like, oh, holy crap. They realized that, you know, they'd lost that well and that it was somehow coming in, you know, it was somewhere outside the area of the well hole itself. So they, even though, okay, remember when we were on the Bennett Creek pad and I was telling you that their target depth, the fourth hole that they drilled on the Crosby pad was actually here? Mm-hmm. So they knew they'd had a lot of problems with these wells, right? They'd lost circulation twice down there trying to get to this target. So they knew it was a problem. But instead of having heavy enough mud to kill a well if they had a problem, they didn't have it on site. And so they realized they had a big problem, and they realized that the methane was pushing all of the drilling fluids and condensate to the surface in all of these holes, little geysers around the well. And so they knew they had a big problem. So they released the valves, the buoy valves on the well, which is the plumbing that keeps it in the ground, so that the methane would come back up through the well, because obviously what was going to happen was they were going to lose the entire area. It was, what had actually happened was, depending who you talk to, industry says that the casing was breached at 250 feet. Our consultants say that they think the whole formation was somehow blown apart by the high pressures. In either case, the methane, they lost the methane, and it pushed all of the drilling fluids and condensates out into this highly fractured and fissured area. And there was a huge fracture zone that ran from the wellhead up dip. And so the methane pushed all of those liquids, all the natural occurring liquid hydrocarbons and the drilling fluids, into that big fracture zone until it filled up, and the little cracks around that one. And then it had nowhere to go but find whatever pathway it could to the surface. So that's what those blowholes were.
So were you
evacuated? Did they come down and evacuate everyone around, or?
Well, so at that point, right, it's by the time they actually did anything, it's decided to do anything, it's late in the day on a Friday. Then when they allowed the well, when they released the plumbing on the well and allowed the methane to come up through the drill stem, then it was out of control because it was under such high pressure. And so at that point they called the first response people here in Clark, which was a team of, I don't know, somewhere between 10, 12 people maybe, to try to evacuate the area. And the big concern then was that it was going to ignite and burn the whole drainage, right? But they had a very small number of people to do that. So, and they had to set up a station up at the top of the subdivision to keep people from coming in. So they were trying to man that station to keep people from coming down into the subdivision and also evacuate people. So they did their best, but they never came to our house. But because Bob, our neighbor, had already been up here, he is actually who evacuated us. Some people evacuated themselves because by then people were catching on. After that conversation with him, after he called, I went outside, and then you could hear it because it was this loud roar. You could smell it, you could feel it. It was like palatable. You could kind of taste it, because it was like this oily kind of, well, it was a weird sensation, but you could feel it. And so I said, what are we supposed to do? And he said, you're just supposed to, they wanted us to turn off our propane tanks and leave. And, I had at that time we had 4 horses and dogs and cats and, a couple of parakeets. And so I said, can I load up the horses? And they were all in this top pasture. And he said, no. He said, we need to get out of here. They're afraid it's going to ignite. So we left. And they told us to go down to the community center and that they would call us, let us know later that night when they got the well under control so that when we could come back to our homes. And so at about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, they brought pizza in and soft drinks and told everybody, the first responders did this, and told everybody that they didn't have it under control and it was probably going to be the following day before we could come home. And so the company would pay for any rooms, would reimburse people if they wanted to go to town and get rooms. And that somebody from the company would come down as soon as they knew the status of the well. So at midnight, a lot of people went to town to get some sleep. I waited. And at noon, or at midnight, the guy who was the on-site manager came down there and told us that they'd lost control of the well, that there was no immediate danger from groundwater contamination, but that they were worried that the methane was going to ignite. And so, of course, my first question was, when is the state going to get here? And they hadn't called the state. So they had this major, very serious industrial incident happening. They had just evacuated 25 households and hadn't contacted the state. So,
because of dumb oversight or because of cover-up?
I said, why haven't you? Because it was Friday, and by the time they knew they had a serious problem, it was too late to call the state offices, was their answer. So, of course, I was furious. And by then I was very familiar with everybody at the agencies because it had been 6 years of fighting with these idiots. And so I called the governor, who, of course, didn't answer his phone. And I called the supervisor of the Oil and Gas Commission, and he didn't answer his phone. And I called the director of the Wyoming environmental, what is it?
Department of Environmental Quality.
Thank you. The Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, John Cora. And he answered his phone at like midnight. It was great. And I said, you've got a huge issue here. And of course, he's in Cheyenne. And our even our regional office is Lander, so that's like a 4-hour drive. So they couldn't get anybody here until the following day. But then at least we had the state here. So at first they did the company had somebody out here the following day doing water tests in water wells right around the pad, saying, oh no, there's no problem, nothing's going to happen, we're fine. And then the state showed up the following day. So they did get a notice of violation, their second notice of violation for the blowout. So part of the what happens when you get a notice of violation in Wyoming is you can accept one of two actions. You can either go under administrative order, which means the state takes you to court, basically, or you can join the state's voluntary remediation program. And part of that program is a public participation plan. If enough citizens are interested, then you can have input into how that voluntary remediation program takes place, which we did. We were, I think, the second or third public to ask for a public participation plan in a voluntary remediation plan. And so that's another part of how effective you can be. Obviously the cat was already out of the bag, but at least we had some input into how the cat was then addressed and where the bag went, you know. So part of that was monitoring. And if you remember, one of the things that we had asked the state to do for 6 years at that point was, well, actually it wasn't that long because the potable water well on the Bennett Creek pad went in like in probably 2004. So 2 years, maybe 3 years. We'd been asking them to test that water well. And so the good thing is that out of this contamination, part of that remedial plan, and one of the things that we asked for was that all of the down gradient water wells be tested. And so the water well on the Bennett Creek pad was one of those wells that we pushed to get tested. So at least that's now being tested. And the plume coming from that pad is recognized. It still wouldn't be recognized today. And it's impacted the Sondermans, which live right next to that pad, their water system. So, so monitoring started, long story short. Right now, this project consists of over 100 monitor points. It impacted both the shallow alluvial aquifer and the deep bedrock aquifers. So over 100 monitor wells, 25 households, 4 points on the creek, and 6 springs that feed into the creek are monitored. Some of them monthly, some of them quarterly, some of them every 6 months, some annually, depending on where you are in terms of the project area. We have huge issues with contamination and have since the blowout. They told us, both the state and industry, Windsor told us that it would never hit any of the water wells and that it would never impact anything across the creek. And Sands Dixon, who lives on the other side of the creek, was adamant about getting monitor wells on that side of the creek, and we really worked hard to get those. And of course they show contamination. The first water well that was impacted, private water well, was the Kings, who lived directly to the west from the pad, and took about a year to the day, or to the month, not to the day, for that well to be impacted. They had BTEX off the charts. The benzene was like 50 times the regulatory level. Benzene is a highly carcinogenic chemical. And they had a list, I'll show you some of that when we get back to the house if you'd like, a list of all kinds of chemicals that are regulated and not regulated in their water. We still have actually we now have a remedy agreement in place for the shallow aquifer, and the remedial alternative for the shallow aquifer was monitored natural attenuation, which means that you just wait for it to flush through the system and continue to monitor it to make sure that it's flushing. I guess that means that somebody downstream out of the project area is getting leukemia from the benzene now, if there's any left. And those deeper zones have not cleaned up. We're sitting on in an area that's extremely hot. The groundwater under this part of this contamination, even in the alluvial wells, monitor wells, is free product in some of the wells.
What does that mean?
That means that it's still hot, gasoline range and diesel range organics at the surface. So that's 8 years later. They immediately came in and drilled a second well on this pad. And they also, although it took them, we were evacuated for 3 days because it took them 3 days to get heavy enough mud in here to kill the well. So the well blew out of control for 3 days. They killed that well, and then they came in and drilled down back into that well. They had permits to drill another well on this pad, a well across the creek, just about where this drainage comes down. The well on the Forest Service, and they were trying to get access to put a well up on top of the hills as you come into the subdivision. None of those applications to drill happened. They were all pulled, including the one on the forest. And no development has taken place since. So you can make a difference. And it's crazy to say, but living with the contamination is horrible and dangerous. But living with the actual drilling was even harder because it just, like I said, the dust, the noise, the light pollution. That Bennett Creek well, when they were drilling that, you could sit in our backyard and read the paper at midnight because of the flaring that was going on and the lights up there. It sounded like a 747 was taken off that pad. They'd light the flare. They flared that well for, I don't know, over a month, trying to figure out, because the pressures are so weird here, that they were trying to get an idea of what what the gas was. And they'd light it, and it would shake our house. It would wake you up. I was a nutcase, I'll tell you. Everybody that lives with this or works in it, in my opinion, are suffering from some kind of traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like until about a year and a half ago, I would get up every night, usually 2-3 times a night, and I just have to go outside and look around. I just have to go outside and make sure something wasn't blowing up or on fire, or it changes your life. So that's the blowout story. Like I said, 8 years later, we have no remedy for the deeper zones. This company has received 2 more notices of violation after this one. So they now have 4 notices of violation, which is probably a record in Wyoming, because it's pretty hard to get a notice of violation in this state. And yet they continue to do whatever they want to do. They could come in, apply for a permit to drill, and probably drill right now. The management of Windsor has turned over probably 4 times now. All of the people who were in upper management are gone. This project was, they had actually done the paperwork to do a public offering, and they were ready to roll with it. And they kept it alive for about a year after the blowout, and then realized that they'd never be able to get any investors because there was, they had this huge contamination. So they pulled the public offering, which meant they lost big because there was no product to get. This was a big scam. This was a big scam for them to come in. And interestingly enough, when they started this project, it was going to be the next Jonah Field, because the big play in Wyoming, one of the big plays, is the Jonah Field, and that's when that was really hot and heavy. And so they came in and they said, yeah, this is going to be the next Jonah Field, and it's going to be all these jobs and, all this money, and we're going to be able to supply gas to, everybody. And does it sound familiar? Sound familiar, David?
Sure does.
And the reality is it was just a way for them to make some money off these leases and unknowing people who were stupid enough to invest in it would have lost their socks. So now, 8 years later, and you can see where all these trees are, those Russian olives right there? That's King's Place as we drive by. I mean, they're just creamed. They've got monitor wells all over down there. When Energy Corporation said they wanted to bring to the little bit of the Bakken to the Beartooths, or when he said it was going to be the next Bakken, and I think I heard 2 versions of that. Well, the first thing it turned my stomach because, you know, I don't only love the Wyoming side of the Beartooths. I grew up on the Montana side of the Beartooths as well, so it literally made me want to puke. And then as I started wrapping my mind around it, it was the same thing that we heard here. It's going to be the next big plague. We're going to, you know, make all these jobs are going to come here, and all of this money's here to be made for the people who live here. And all I could think about was what we live with, and how it was going to mean the same thing for everybody in that area that it's meant for us. And for, quite frankly, all the people that I have had the honor to represent over the last 15 years. You know, people in the Deaver area, people in the Pavilion area, people all over, you know, it's a crime. And it's also a public health crisis that's going to hit like probably no other that we've seen. The other thing that happens that nobody anticipates is it totally destroys your community, because you've got people who are making money from it, and so, you know, then you're at odds with the people who are getting the impact are at odds with the people who are making the money from it. You've got, and a lot of people who can leave. Like many of the people that really were the most adamant about fighting this development have sold and left because they, you know, you can't deal with it. You can't, it's so difficult. It's just such a game changer. It changes your whole life and how you think about things and what you believe your community is. There is no wrong way to fight this. And that's one thing I've learned, because when this all first started, you know, I couldn't believe it was happening. And I couldn't believe, I would tell everybody what was going on, and I couldn't believe that there was anybody out there who would agree with what they were doing. And people, if I had a nickel for every time somebody said to me, oh, you just have it wrong, that can't happen. Because people don't understand how few rights you have against this kind of development. And you know what your rights actually are as a surface owner. You don't have any rights. And people don't get that. You think that this might be happening in some third world country somewhere, but you don't think it could possibly happen to you in this country. So you fight it however you can fight it. And so at first I would talk to somebody until I thought I could convince them of what it really was about. And of course, there are some people that are never going to believe you, or that aren't impacted and really don't care, because they're getting the benefit from the industry. So a lot of what has happened with fracking and these huge shale plays is that it has definitely taken it to a wider audience, because more and more people are being impacted. And you know, the drilling part is bad, the fracking part is bad, there's going to be a lot of impact from that. But the reality is, we really need to be looking at these areas now that are under production and that have where the drilling and fracking isn't continuous, but the development is, the production is, because that's when you really start to see the contamination. That's when you see what you're left with. And you know, when you see what has happened here, the amount of contamination that has happened here, and then you multiply that by how many places are going to be impacted by this development as fracking goes on. I mean, basically, it's the technology that allows them to go into more and more places, right, at deeper and deeper depths. And you can bet, while we're sitting here talking about fracking, they've already got the next technology that they're going to use. And it's going to be more intrusive, and it's going to be worse, and it's going to have more severe consequences.